We are about to find out what debut is, a fusion of the arts. We will soon find out. Here it is. Debut. Welcome to Debut, a fusion of storytelling and play. Where we take three accomplished storytellers who tell a story for the very first time on debut. You are the first listening audience. And before debut, we like to know a little bit about the tellers. And so let me bring on this teller. Sam comes to us from Utah. He's a storyteller, singer, songwriter of exceptional talent. He's brought his talent to the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the National Storytelling Festival, and the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival. He's also traveled as far as Canada and Bulgaria. But today he's with us. That's what's on paper. Let me just tell you about Sam. Sam knows story. He was raised with story. And at the same time, he knows how to cultivate story listeners. Whether he's producing stories, singing a song, or telling a story, it is well worth listening and captivating. Ladies and gentlemen, let me bring on Sam Payne. Welcome, Sam.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.
It is wonderful. And you just came back from a live storytelling, is that right?
Boy, it's been a long time, but yes, there we were on stage, and what a pleasure it was.
How'd it feel to
It was great. There's nothing like this is an interesting time. We all learned to speak a new language. We learned to speak this language of communicating digitally, and frankly, it was an enormous blessing, wasn't it? I mean, we found ourselves virtually in the same room with people all over the country, all over the world, and we could share in ways that I think maybe were surprising even to us. But there's nothing like being in the same space with and sharing and communing with an audience, and it was a real pleasure. Yeah, Kevin's referring, of course, to a concert that Kim Whitecamp and I did just the other day, and it was in front of a big happy audience there, ready to enjoy some stories as we crawl out from under the effects of the pandemic, which we're doing carefully and slowly, but boy, light at the end of the tunnel. It's great.
But as you know, there's redeeming value in uh, digital telling stories too, whether
Yeah.
we're bridging international. So I'm hoping that we do a little bit of mix. And I've heard some
Yeah.
festivals that are like, oh, we'll not only do the live, but for that person in Alaska that can't see, we'll also do some recordings because I think storytellers can find a way to make it not distance learning, but connected learning. That's
Yeah.
my goal. Um,
I think that's been the big surprise for us, hasn't it? Again, we sort of figured out this technology thinking that it might be just a stopgap, and now it may stay with us. We have found ourselves able to connect in this way, and it's a little bit miraculous.
And after all, from this debut was born because I started live with a program called Storyville
Yeah.
that was open mic and featured tellers. But honestly, since I am a crazy practitioner of play, we
Yeah.
ended up with the audience not being so silent, but being involved. And we need to talk a little bit about the story making as much as the storytelling, because
Sure. Yeah.
from your experience, we hear a lot of the telling, but we think, wow, how did they do it? It's mystery, right? But you've also given workshops and talked with others, and so I'll ask you this question: how did story find you, Sam?
I am the son of a singer songwriter. My dad is a folk singer who spent his early life, who spent my very early life, my tiny childhood, making records and selling them and playing concerts and things like that. And his methodology in those days was to go door to door. He was a door to door peddler of his own musical material, you
Well,
know.
I love it.
And he'd knock on doors in college towns, and kids in dorms would open their doors to him, and he'd go in and play a couple songs and sell them a record album. And I think I just kind of had a front row seat to a lot of content creation, you know? And so that kind of seeped into my very, very early childhood. When I grew up, I began to kind of follow that path. I developed a catalog of songs and published a number of albums and did concerts and was a touring musician. And in the end, my songs were the lyrics to my songs were just dense enough that I found that in order for an audience to enjoy them, I had to explain them a little bit. and and that storytelling, that talking about the making of the songs on stage became something that audiences enjoyed about my performances. And finally, as so often happens with guys like me, somebody in the storytelling community, I won't mention his name, but he's Andy Offutt Irwin, sort of said, this thing that you're doing, there's there's a world of people doing this, and it's just on the other side of this door. And here, let me open the door, and in you go. So
Well, we're so glad that Andy did that. And sometimes he opens doors and you trip a little. but and
that's
we're so thankful for Andy as well. I
right.
also was a door-to-door salesman at 14 to
Uh,
18. Before they had paper routes, I had to build those routes. I'd rather be selling music. But I did get to learn about people, and your story about having to explain the songs reminds me of the late great someone I think we both know, Pat Mendoza's
sure.
introduction to
Yeah.
the story. He was a bouncer, and he said that there was a power outage, and the guy came up, and it was an unruly crowd, and said, if you can just keep them entertained for 2 hours till I can find the power. He started telling stories, and they started wanting more stories, and so he became a storyteller. Um, so it's so interesting on everybody's origin story, and
Yeah.
and at the same time, we learn from the people like your father. I was doing some background on your work, and one of your first stories that you heard was the ugly duckling of Danny Kaye. Is that
It's
right?
true. Yeah. It's absolutely true, and I'll tell you, I think that's that when I was 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old, was really kind of the first time that I had a notion that a story could be more than, entertaining, that a story could be enriching and that a story could save your life. I I had a gig, in those days. I was the ring bearer for my aunt's wedding, and I was terrified. I was terrified of what it was stage fright. I was going to have to walk down that aisle, and I was going to have to hold up the pillow with the rings on it. And I hid out in the coat closet of the Baptist church, just feeling sorry for myself and feeling sad and frightened. And my mom found me there, and she said, "Listen, all you've got to do is walk down that aisle with your head held noble and high." And she quoted that old Danny Kaye version of the story of the ugly duckling from the film Hans Christian Andersen, right? And I was comforted and uplifted, and I was able to do the gig, and my aunt was able to, in fact, get married, which is, clearly she couldn't have done without me, right? And yeah, it was the very first, I think, the very first notion that I'd had that a story could come back and save you.
I love it. And I used to
Yeah.
sit with my five brothers and sisters, and we'd say, "Once there was an ugly duckling."
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just powerful. And I also
Yeah.
found an old 60s book where Danny Kaye wrote down a bunch of stories.
Uh,
And so you definitely have to check that out. And you
yeah,
mentioned
I
the ring
will.
bearer. I was teaching a graduate or a storytelling class, and this person told a story. He said that they were in the wedding, and the youngest was the ring bearer, and he'd go around, or she'd go around going, grrr, grrr. And he said,
The ring bear, right? Yeah.
And then she finally came up to her and said, "What kind of bear am I supposed to be?" And so that's the
That's
other thing.
very wonderful. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Stories about the beauty of language, the poetic
Yeah.
changes of language. What do you look for when you find when a story says, "I need to be told by Sam Payne"? What is that process like?
I love that you say it that way, because I think I I I think we work hard to develop a sense of which stories of sort of the endless parade of tales that can be told are are suited to us, are ours to tell, And I really do try to honor that part of the process, not I think not every story that comes across my path is a story for me to tell, but those ones that are, I think once you recognize a story as yours to tell, then comes the wrestle of trying to figure out how to tell it, and it becomes this kind of tug of war between working the story into a form that fits in your mouth and and the story pulling on what it wants to be, and you wind up striking a compromise, I think, between what the story wants to be and the story that you're telling. That was certainly true even of working on songs. You're taking an idea and trying to wrestle it into a form of rhyme scheme and chorus and bridge and everything else, and the song at the same time is pulling in a direction itself, and you finally kind of come to an agreement with each other.
I love it. And sometimes you're not ready for that story. I have
Yeah,
found that with some cultural variations that I had to do a lot more homework before
yeah,
because I was patterning it against an American style of what I know of story. And some cultures don't follow that, obviously. And it
yeah,
takes a little more homework. And I am from listening to a lot of tellers, we can expand where we are. Now, I
yeah.
try not to pigeonhole what I tell. So I tell personal tales or fairy tales, and we have penchants for things. How do you go about saying, this is my challenge? How do you challenge yourself as a storyteller?
Well, I find myself, I find my interests changing over time, right? I find myself, you tell stories that have been favorites for a long time, and you find yourself, putting them on like a comfortable shirt, but then something else catches your fancy, and you want to dance with that for a while, you know, and always being on the lookout, and allowing yourself to undergo those kind of changes in perspective and changes in interest is kind of what keeps it fresh and exciting, and as you say, challenging. I for a long time was interested in stories about fathers and sons, and a lot of my material kind of ran along those lines, and then that kind of expanded to I became interested in just stories about the relationships between people of different generations, and over the last little while, my interests have tightened up a little bit, become a little bit more specific, because I think because music has been such a part of my life, and takes such a prominent place in my storytelling as well. I've been interested over the last little while in powerful experiences that people have with music. And a lot of the content that I've developed for the stage and for recordings over the last little while has taken that direction. I'm interested in the role that music plays in people's lives. And so a lot of my stories are about potent experiences that people have with music.
I've been listening to a lot of John Prine, who does a lot with music and story, or used to.
Right.
And music is powerful, and it deserves its own story. I've also listened
Yeah.
to Pete Seeger talk a little bit about that, and
Yeah.
Ani DeFranco I've been listening to. So that's quite a range. Sometimes you feel like you know a person from listening or telling the story, and I've listened to a story that you tell about an astronaut. Uh,
Oh,
uh, can you bring back a little bit of that?
well, I I'm a fan. I'm a fan of space exploration. I don't know anything. I'm just a fan. When I was in Elementary school, 4th, 5th, or 6th grade, I remember our, librarian. In those days, we called her the media center specialist,
Mm.
right? And the media center specialist gathered all of the upperclassmen in my elementary school, which meant the 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, into the tables at the media center, and which was the library, and pushed a big TV out in front of us on a cart, and we all watched the Space Shuttle Columbia take off for the first time. That, for me, was the experience that I had that was analogous to the experience that so many had of watching the lunar landing, right? And it just spun me pretty hard. Since then, this notion of this kind of visionary act of of going out among the stars has been very precious to me, and I find myself really captivated by it in the way that a fan is captivated, right? I mean, don't ask me about trajectories or fuel consumption or math, but I'm just a fan. and and there are space stories that kind of captivate me. I found myself captivated by the story of Jerry Linenger, the American astronaut who, together with a couple of Russian cosmonauts, had to do battle aboard the space station Mir with the worst fire in an orbiting spacecraft in the history of space travel. How do you do battle with a fire? I mean, here we would just gather the family and leave the house and wait on the curb and call 911. But when you're in outer space, what do? I found myself captivated with the story of the Mars rover Opportunity that was to spend 90 days on a mission on Mars and wound up spending 14 years and capturing our hearts. I find myself captivated by the story of Perseverance, the Mars rover that was flown to Mars by all of its human friends at JPL, mostly at home over Zoom. All those guys went home and flew a Mars rover to Mars using their home computers. It's really a remarkable story. And of course, when I was just a little kid, the Voyager spacecraft were launched, and I think that's such a poetic, vast story. The story of those space probes. I'm just a fan.
Sam, here in Ohio, we have no problem with space stories, and they're very powerful. And I just have to tell you that I was in Barnes and Noble, and the person leaned over to me at the cash register and said, "I just want you to know, behind you is John Glenn," and he comes in every week. He used to, and get the New York Times. And
Wow.
just to think, someone like John Glenn goes into an ordinary, but those are where stories really come from. I mean, it is the wonder, the curiosity, and we just, I think after we tell a story, people should say, "Oh, I want to know more," or even go out
Yeah.
and research that. And if we don't follow the loves, what can we do? But
Yeah.
you mentioned something catching your fancy, or we taking risks, so that comes into play. How important is play in your practice, in your songwriting, in your story making, and or your storytelling?
Well, the version of play that exists in the very most potent place in my life is the conversation that I have with my wife while I'm developing something for the stage. That goes both ways. My wife works with children and Shakespeare. My wife, for 25 years, has run a Shakespeare company where the actors are all little kids. And when I say little kids, I mean I'm talking about kids between the ages of 3 and 18. And it's a marvelous thing, to watch these little kids tangling with Shakespeare. So we talk a lot about her work and we talk a lot about my work, and that is maybe my favorite part of all of this, those conversations between my wife and I, about the work. And I don't think anything could survive without it. I find myself relying so much on that exchange of ideas. And as we allow ourselves to play in the way that you're talking about, right? I think that's what we're doing. We're allowing other people into the space of the story to kind of dance with us as we're creating it, and their influence becomes sort of part of that push pull, what I want the story to be and what the story seems to want to be on its own. And I really value that. I mean, again, talking about my experience with my wife, I really value that. That's one of the most valuable things in our lives together as we have those conversations, because certainly we talk about the work, right? We talk about the story, or we talk about the play, or whatever it is, but that leaks out into every other aspect of everything else that we talk about. We find ourselves talking about the way that we feel, and we find ourselves talking about the things that we believe, and we find ourselves talking about the world around us, and that wouldn't exist if we didn't kind of open the door to that interaction very concertedly. And as we play with these stories, it's fun to get inside each other's heads, and use as the engine for that interaction, a piece that's going to go on stage.
What a great combination. Shakespeare and story and song. My wife's an improv comedian, so we're rich with play, and sometimes we have to play out loud. I've been told that storytelling can be a lonely business, and I've always
Yeah.
challenged that. It can be when you're paying the taxes, it can be when you're on the road, but it doesn't have to be when you're making and playing. So it sounds like you know the importance of a deep listening partner. That if you look over and say, I want to talk like with this story as though I was a frog, that person might say, go ahead.
Right.
But the guy at the grocery store might not do that, because I've tried
Right.
that
Yeah.
and it doesn't work. But
Yeah.
so play is, I mean, we've got to. When I first started into the storytelling practice, I was, there was no training. I was mimicking what I heard on an audio cassette, and a lot of people do that. They mimic the greats, and
Yeah.
kind of move forward from there, because I think we need more talk and definition and about our practice. We should pull it
Yeah.
out in the open, at least among the colleagues like yourself, right? I've had the good fortune of working with you and being on Appleseed. We also want to give a plug to Appleseed. Let's do that while we're here, because here is a place that long before the Zoom world, Sam has been the producer of Appleseed, which is featuring many storytellers, whether thematic or not, storytellers that we've heard or not heard, but only on Appleseed, and created an amazing audience and caliber for understanding the process of story by presenting storytellers and storytellers talking about the art.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for mentioning the Appleseed. I have been thrilled to be the host of this daily radio show featuring storytellers of all kinds from all over the place, just about every day. We've been on the air since 2013 and featured hundreds of storytellers and thousands of stories. And we just we've produced about 1,800 episodes, and it's such that's such a pleasure, the blessing of being able to work with the material of my friends and colleagues, and to bring that material to an audience on the radio that's a blessing that's not lost on me. Not everybody gets to do that, and I know that, and I do get to do that every day, and it's really a delight for me.
And we'll have a link on how people can get attuned and tuned in to the Appleseed.
Yeah.
Sam, what are the next challenges or promises in the next 5 years of you as a teller? What is your ambitions there?
That's a pretty big question.
I never said I was going to ask a small one.
And I'm not quite sure I know how to answer it. I look forward to certainly, if uh, if things continued as they have been, it would be great, right? I mean, I love what I get to do exactly as I get to do it now. And if somebody said to me, you're going to spend the next 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or 20 years with no changes, it's just going to be as it is now, right? I could live with that for dang sure. right? Um, but yeah, we'll see. I'm riding this wave as it comes. You know, I'm happy to sort of meet the universe as it comes. You're asking me to make plans, Kevin, and I.
No worries. I have trouble making plans, so why am I asking someone else?
That's right. Yeah.
But you also create vision, which is great to see. I'm finding that storytelling is moving in new audiences. And over the years, have you found new audiences changing, new organizational structure, new corporations? Why do you think storytelling should or should not move?
Well, it will always evolve, right? It has always evolved, and it will always revolve. It will always evolve. We find ourselves attached to one thing or another that means a great deal to us, and it's. I think it's great. I think it's fine to hold the ground that you want to hold, right? But if we find ourselves getting in any way grumpy about the evolution of the world around us, that that's tricky. I mean, I think we kind of handicap ourselves, right? And there are people who really embrace some of the direction, the trajectory that storytelling is taking in the world, and the new forms that people are discovering, and the blurring of lines between one kind of storytelling and another. There are people who really embrace that innovation, and that's fantastic. And there are other people who want to preserve and hold the ground that storytelling has held for a long time, who are more dedicated to traditional ways of storytelling and the way that it has been, and that's valuable too. You know, it takes all of us. It takes all of us, and in a world that's ever changing and ever evolving, it's really it's wonderful to know that there are roots and branches. You know.
And there's room for everyone at the table. You're right,
Yeah.
roots and branches. And one of the things that you've also been a champion of working with is youth as tellers and young people. And I really think that those are the people that are bringing the roots and branches. And I don't. I sometimes I think we need to step back a little and
Yeah.
let them grow, but be there to say, hey, this is a tenet of storytelling. You might want to follow that, but let you bring yourself forward for where it is, whether it's storytelling in rap or storytelling on stilts or whatever it is. I have seen both of those.
That's it, Kevin. That's my next thing. That's the next 5 years for me.
I
Is
want
storytelling on
pictures.
stilts.
I will come to that show. I will fly and I will come to that show. But debut is about um, really the beauty of play and
Yeah.
not a fear of public speaking, because I believe that the more someone supports you, the less there's fear. We teach people to be afraid to
Yeah.
speak, and we need to quit that, right? Lance Henson.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'll tell you, Kevin, I have long admired the work that you do with young people and storytelling. I think about it a lot. And as you talk about it now, as you talk about working with young people, I am reminded of a moment, let's call it, when my grown-up son was 2 years old and was in love in those days with railroad trains, you know. And there was a moment in church. My 2-year-old had brought an enormous, like, gallon Ziploc bag filled with railroad cars to church. And as I was watching him kind of interact with those railroad cars, I had this. I had a moment, a kind of epiphany moment, where I saw him growing up in e even though we would exist on the planet at the same time, I saw my son experiencing the world in a very different way than I had, and experiencing a different world than the world that made me. And I realized that there were likely some places that I wouldn't be able to follow him. You know, that he would go out into a world and make wonderful things happen. And I maintained this kind of fatherly hope that he would uh, come back and bring me the gifts of that world, that he would turn around and give me the gift of his insight in a new world, like I had tried to give him mine when he was small, and yeah, I think there's a lot of I think our young people will go and do remarkable things, even in this arena, the arena of storytelling, that we have not dreamed of, you know and they'll come back and they'll turn to us with gifts in their hands.
I agree. And there needs to be time that we need to look back and look forward to make sure people are walking forward, and when we look back we say come on board, or
Yeah,
let me come to you because you're in a
right.
different stage or place. And I have to be
Yeah,
reminded, I've had 70-year-old storytellers say, look, I'm new, I'm young storyteller, and they
yeah,
are in the art. So we need to open doors and welcome. The story that you just told about your son and the railroad tracks, there's an old folk song called Daddy, What's a Train? And just imagine being in a world where you had to explain what a train is. But it kind of encapsulates what you just said, is there's going to be a time that time is past and time is forward. But we should
yeah.
always remember what that train does, that kind of. So, Sam, why debut?
Well, I'll tell you. I'll be frank with you. Uh, because you invited me.
I'm glad you accepted the invitation.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm really thrilled about the opportunity. Not too long ago, I have spent so many years now on the storytelling stage. I think that I may not have drawn any kind of a hard, bright line between the years that I spent on stage primarily as a singer-songwriter and the years that I've spent on stage as a storyteller. There's so much crossover. There's so much that those disciplines share that I think I haven't drawn a very hard, bright line between the time that I was doing one and the time that I'm doing another, right? However, and I say that to say that very recently, a songwriter friend of mine reached out and asked me if I wanted to be a part of a little sort of email group of songwriters writing a song a week and sharing them with each other. And I was very happy and honored to be a part of that group. And so for the last several weeks, I've been writing a song a week, kind of in sort of in that way that I used to work. Right. And I'm stretching muscles that I haven't stretched in a long time. And I'm doing it in public. And I mean, well, insofar as as this group is public, right? There are a number of people in it, and I feel stretched, and I feel vulnerable, and I sometimes feel sheepish, and sometimes feel proud, and uh, and stepping outside of a comfort zone and doing it in public is, I feel like, what I'm doing with debut, and it just feels like a healthy exercise.
I love it. And we're so glad that you're going to be um, sharing with us on debut and just playing and having
Yeah.
fun. At debut, I work for you. We're working on the story direction, and we move forward with it. And I think, one of the things, me, I'm an educator as well as a storyteller, and I want people to learn from the debut. I love the raw performance, but as the storytellers that have been on debut, say either before or after, it's just a whole different experience. And
Yeah.
so we need to be bathed in different storytelling explosions and experiences so that
Yeah.
we understand storytelling more. I mean, every year I learn more about it.
Yeah, and it's a step on a journey toward getting stuff ready. I mean, I remember early in my storytelling career asking other storytellers, because I would put a brand new piece on stage, a piece that I hadn't performed before on stage, and I would find it kind of falling flat, and it not kind of coming together until many performances later. And I remember asking even some of my favorite storytellers, some of the storytellers that I've admired for a long time, how long does it take for a piece to kind of settle down and take on a comfortable life of its own? And I in the beginning, I expected people to say, "Oh yeah, it takes 4 or 5 performances," but I was getting responses from tellers that I admired that smack more of, it takes a year of solid performance of a piece before I feel comfortable with it, or it takes 60 performances before I start to feel comfortable with a story, and with every one of those pieces that you put in front of an audience, there's a first time that you stepped on stage and did it. And of course, for what we're going to share on the 27th, that will be what this is, the first time that something stepped on stage. And for it to step on stage in an environment where there's such delightful feedback and friendship and conversation, that's something I'm looking forward to.
Debu's motto is "There's beauty in the beginning." So we look forward to the beginning debut of the story that you're going to tell. Sam Payne, you now have the last word.
Listen, I'll take it. And the last word will be, I'm excited to be with Debut on June 27th. Join me for what I hope will be a terrific experience with the very wonderful Joanne and Jessica, and of course, Kevin. Looking forward to having you with us.